Hello and welcome to Artful Inquiry, Edinburgh College of Art's research podcast. I'm Dr. James Cook, ECA Director of Research, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lucy Weir, Reader in the History of Art at ECA. Her new book, What Moves Them? A Global History of Modern Dance, will be published by Alan Lane in 2025 and is based on research supported by a Leverhulme Trust Research Fellowship. So let's start at the beginning. What first drew you to modern dance as a research focus?
Well, modern dance is something that I first started exploring as a master's student, and it was bringing together two worlds that I inhabited simultaneously. One which was within the university, which was my studies of art history, and outside that, a deeper interest in dance and specifically in modern dance. And the starting point was this discovery, this moment of overlap between those two worlds at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, where I discovered that the Dadaists had collaborated with some of the pioneers of modern dance in Germany, Rudolf Laban and Mary Wigman. And that moment where it felt like this cast of characters had all come together in this chaotic explosion made me realise that these weren't separate disciplines, but they were actually completely intertwined.
Great. So it's really quite an interdisciplinary world where you sort of can't understand one of these disciplines fully without quite understanding what's going on in the other.
Absolutely. I think that's the same with many of the performing arts and the visual arts, that the histories of them are completely intertwined from the outset, that you can't really talk about the history of dance, for instance, without talking about visual art or music, that everything, all of these histories are interconnected. But finding that there was this overlap really between these key moments of avant-garde visual art and really the origins of performance arts with the activities at the Cabaret Voltaire, and also this moment of change within this history of modern dance, that they come together at that moment in time. That was a really pivotal realisation for me, and that really is what set me on the course of all the research I did afterwards.
Wow, incredible as well that happened as a master's student. That's great. How then did that develop into a book project?
Well, the PhD that I went on to do after my master's was originally meant to focus on Dada, performance and dance, and then it mushroomed into something completely different. So it became an exploration of three key women in the history of modern dance. And that project shifted as well. It began starting with Mary Wigman, Martha Graham and Pina Bausch, three key figures of different periods in the evolution of modern dance, but thinking increasingly about them as global figures, not necessarily as representatives of, say, German and American modern dance, but actually as women who were part of this global art form, something that was constantly on the move, that these were figures who themselves were on the move, that it was a project that was all about movement, but movement across time and space as well as movement of the body. And that really was the starting point for thinking about this much wider history, these points of connection and overlap where figures are meeting one another in random locations, it seems, around the globe. And I kept coming across these incredible moments of happenstance, these circumstances where two people happen to be in the same place at the same time, that reading about it afterwards, you think, how is it possible that they both ended up in that room together? And realising that the story of modern dance really is one that is constructed from these chance encounters.
Yeah, I suppose that's a difficult thing to kind of research serendipity and sort of these moments of chance encounter that I suppose you get the sort of sliding door moments of what would have happened if two different people hit.
Yeah, and that's when I started to envisage it as well as a kind of big global family tree, that I actually started to draw out these terrible diagrams of working at where people met one another and when, and realising that it really was a huge, expansive global family that goes back generations, that these moments of connection are what ultimately drive the evolution of the art form.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose as a sort of historian, I've always been quite interested in the prosopographical method and that kind of idea of the sort of network analysis.
Yeah.
And drawing on, but particularly when you maybe don't know everything about the biographies of these kind of large figures, and actually you are dealing with an art form that's dependent on a really, really large cast of characters
Yeah.
who are all contributing lots of very different things that actually being able to visualize something as a network where that can be so useful to view that.
And I think it also moves us away from questions about nationalism or the nation state as well. It sort of breaks down borders because you realise that this is an art form that's been driven by people moving across borders, across the world, almost constantly on the move, really, and that they are encountering one another in different spaces, in different environments, moments in time. So it for me, it complicated the picture, but it made it much richer, and it made me appreciate modern dance as a thoroughly global art form in itself.
I mean, I think that's something that comes out quite strongly in the book is the word global here, and that's obviously very important to it. And I think you've described it as the first global history of modern dance, sort of aimed at that general audience. What I suppose you're breaking through some barriers here. That there must be a reason why that hasn't been done before. Why do you think that is?
Well, I suppose on the one hand, modern dance is kind of a niche interest. It is a relatively niche field. It's not an enormous area of academic inquiry, although there are brilliant scholars that work on histories of modern dance. I think within the public consciousness, maybe people feel it's not an accessible art form. They might feel it's something that's not for them and that they don't understand it very readily. And I think a lot of that is the fact it's an art form that is about the body, it's about movement rather than words. And so it's a very visual art form, but it can feel inaccessible because the sort of abstracted movements are not necessarily easily intelligible or readable straight away. And so I think that on the one hand, there's maybe not a plethora of work available for the general reader on this history because it's seen as belonging to a niche field of interest. But actually, when you start to dig into the stories of these individuals, what you realise is that the figures who've driven this history or this evolution of modern dance, their stories are inextricably linked to where they are in space and time. These are stories that are about war, are about conflict, are about migration, crisis, as well as moments of celebration, that they are linked to the history of modern times. And so every single figure within this book is their story is bound up with what's happening around them in the world and the particular difficulties that they faced in setting out their stall and making a career. And that runs from the beginning of the 20th century with Isadora Duncan departing Europe and going to post-revolutionary Russia in the very earliest days of the Soviet Union to set up the first Soviet school of modern dance, which, spoiler alert, didn't work out, to Catherine Dunham and her work during the civil rights movement and her efforts to really centre Black dancers on concert stages at a time where theatres were still thoroughly segregated. Right through to the end of the 20th century, dancers like the Chinese artist Wen Wei, whose work is all about memory and cultural memory, but also about political memories as well, and how the body stores these memories. And so it became, for me, an opportunity to think about a sort of sweeping global history at the same time, that each of these individuals has something incredibly valuable to say about their culture, but also the sort of wider world that they find themselves in.
Yeah, that's. I suppose everyone's going to find a way to connect with the book, sort of through their own disciplines or their own ways of thinking. I suppose there's kind of it connects with something that's relevant to your own experience.
Yeah, that's the hope. I think if you're interested in politics, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in music or the arts, there are all of these moments of encounter and overlap, and hopefully it will allow people to see that modern dance isn't it's not an art form that exists locked inside a box, but it's something that is thoroughly accessible because it is about us. It's about humanity, and it's it's about the world. So it should be something that we all have access to.
Yeah. So there was a quote that I found quite interesting in the book. I'm not interested in how people move, but what moves them, which seems to be quite foundational to your thinking throughout. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit through how you think that idea helps frame the book's approach to dance history.
I really love this quote. I mean, I'm a pretty unapologetic Pina Bausch fangirl, and this line of "I'm not interested in how people move, but what moves them" was her explanation for how she chose her dancers. So in one of the rare interviews that she granted, an interviewer asked her, how do you pick these dancers? Because her company looked so different from other dance companies. The dancers are a range of ages, of body sizes, heights, shapes. The dancers come from different backgrounds in terms of the training they've had, and they all come from very different cultural backgrounds as well. It's a really global company. And I thought that about that quote, that what was so striking about it was it didn't really just apply to how Bausch constructed her company and how she constructed her pieces, but it seemed like a really important metaphor for this art form of modern dance more broadly, because modern dance isn't one language of movement or one style or one form. It's something that's constantly shape-shifting through time, that it evolves with every choreographer who steps into the frame, that it moves from, in the first decades of the 20th century, being very structured, having these quite rigorous techniques in many cases that are almost like formal languages of dance. And then in the second half of the 20th century, really in that post-Second World War period, there's a move away from rigid or rigorous technique towards something that is more flowing, that is more free, that is in many cases much more expressive as well. And it's fascinating for me to look at this broader picture and to see how everything that we sort of categorise as modern dance can look very different depending on where you are, what moment we are in, what context we are in. It all belongs to the same family again. It's all part of that same family tree, but it looks remarkably different depending on where you are and the perspective you're looking at it from.
Yeah, I suppose that's often the case, that the window, the lens that we choose to apply through which we look for our research, it drastically changes the object that you look at. I suppose one thing that's very clear in your work is that you're very deliberately, I think, moving away from that sort of Euro-American narrative, which does often hold for this kind of work, much more towards a global and, I suppose, a migratory account of modern dance. But I'm assuming that's very much a deliberate thing. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why that's important and how you think that changes our approach to the discipline.
I think it's vital when we look at this particular history to shift away from a received narrative that was very deeply ingrained when I began my research. And I think it's still quite deeply embedded in a lot of the literature around modern dance, that we can trace the evolution of the art form to these key figures who are pretty much all European or American, and that I suppose there is one narrative that modern dance is inherently a pretty American art form as well. So these histories tend to be rooted in Northern Europe, particularly in Germany, and also in the United States. And it's undeniable that there are really important figures who have this long-reaching influence. And in the introduction of the book, I look at three of these figures, who are Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, and Martha Graham, as the sort of founding mothers almost of modern dance. And what they all have in common is that they are all American women, and they are all American women who are interested in breaking away from tradition and doing something radical and new. And in each case, they were also very heavily influenced by cultures that were external to their own. So Isadora Duncan was fascinated with ancient Greece. Ruth St. Denis was fascinated with cultures of the Middle and Far East and Southeast Asia. And Martha Graham, similarly, was very interested in the cultures of the Far East, but also of Native American tribes as well. And all of these women incorporated into their choreography and into the way that they taught dance these quite exoticized, orientalized traits. But part of the problem of that narrative being the accepted starting point for modern dance is that it negates the people who came from outside Europe and outside the United States who also had a really formative influence. And that's the reason the book's first chapter starts with Michio Ito, who was a Japanese dancer, travelled first to Germany, where he trained at Dalcroze's school in Hellerau, initially as a musician, and then went to London. And it was in London that chance encounters with some well-placed aristocrats began his career in dance. So he began to perform these sort of modern dance compositions for audiences that were fascinated by his exotic, orientalized wafting around the room. None of it was really grounded in any kind of cultural specificity, but he was held up as this really exciting, authentic Japanese dancer. And so he sort of rode this wave of success of Orientalism through to establishing a name for himself. He ended up performing at the London Coliseum on the basis of dancing at some dinner parties. He met the Prime Minister at a dinner at a point where he barely spoke English and wanted to speak with him in German. And this was after the outbreak of the First World War. So it was an extraordinary moment for him to arrive into London society and for circumstances to shift his fate in the direction of modern dance. But it was when he came to the United States that he really began to formalise the technique, and he trained generations of dancers who would themselves go on to be extremely influential figures. He overlapped with Martha Graham on many occasions. One of Graham's sisters danced for Ito in his company, and yet he was largely written out of the wider history of modern dance, primarily because after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he was one of the first Japanese Americans to be arrested, was put into an internment camp, and was then repatriated to Japan. So he died almost in obscurity, and even now is largely a footnote in any history of modern dance. But the more that I dug into his story, and I was lucky enough to connect with his granddaughter, who's still alive in Los Angeles, the more that I dug into that story, the more I realised he was a central figure in the evolution of American modern dance. He was one of the pivotal figures in the evolution of modern dance. And yet he will never be a household name in the same way as one of his contemporaries like Martha Graham.
Yeah, so it's I suppose again it's showing how the vagaries of chance encounters worked both in his favour, but then very much against for the sort of very, very hostile historiography. Then
and it reinforces this particular narrative as well about who the central figures in this history are, and I think that it becomes a more complicated but a much richer picture when we start to consider the plethora of voices and the different cultures that all fed into the evolution of modern dance. So to see it as an art form that doesn't just exoticize other cultures, but actually originates from Japan, from India, as well as emerging from Germany and from the United States, what I hope the book will show is that modern dance is happening everywhere, really, in the world. It's not centred around the West and expanding outwards, but it's taking place the world over at the same time.
Obviously, this book is pretty global, and you know you're moving everywhere from East Asia to West Africa, and spotlighting a range of choreographers along the way. How did you choose all of these various artists and regions to focus on? And are there any that are particularly sort of surprising, or any of those regions or choreographers that you found particularly challenging?
I suppose one of the biggest challenges was narrowing down the range to focus on. So the book is consists of 10 chapters that look at 10 different choreographers and an introduction where I've sneaked 3 people in, which seemed like a good idea at the time. And there were obvious challenges around some of the artists where maybe we didn't share a common language, or where I had to really do quite a lot of work to understand the context from which those artists were emerging. Something that made it a lot easier was connecting with family members and descendants of some of the artists. In the case of the living choreographers, being able to interview them and talk to them about their work was really helpful, and I think really helped me get inside not just the motivations behind the choreography, but also the techniques. Probably the most challenging part, though, was reconstructing, in a sense, the material from the very beginning of the book, because there is quite a lot of material at the outset that was not captured on film and that exists only in memories, whether those are embodied memories of dancers who had learned pieces of choreography, who had passed them on, that we had seen reconstructed later, or descriptions or accounts that were given in critical reviews. And that is always the most challenging thing, going back to what a dance looked like and trying to reimagine it and trying to visualize it when you have so little to go on. But the other priority that I had was wanting to broaden the narrative away from the general understanding that readers might have about some of the better known figures. So while I don't expect that people will recognise the names of everyone in the book, there are certain figures like Isadora Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, who are pretty well known, or in her case, quite notorious figures. And with Duncan, I wanted to avoid a narrative that focused on the tragedies of her life, the death of her 2 children, for instance, or her very tragic but unfortunately spectacular death. And I wanted instead to think about Duncan's life and Duncan as a revolutionary, because she was a revolutionary. She lived a life that broke from all convention and tradition. She refused to marry. She refused to adhere to any of the expectations of a woman of her status. And she also refused to be pinned down. She moved constantly. She moved from the United States to Europe. And then she accepted an invitation from Lunacharsky to set up a school for modern dance in the nascent Soviet Union. And she spent a couple of really difficult years in post-revolutionary Russia trying to establish a school with children who were mostly starving, living in absolute destitution, and seeing a society that was undergoing total change. She was there at a really pivotal moment in time, which must have been fascinating, but also incredibly difficult. And the fallout of that was that she ended up being stripped of her US citizenship. She was viewed as a Bolshevik sympathizer, and she became something of a political pariah because of her desire to work in Russia and some maybe unwise statements about communism that she threw in. But what I think is so crucial about Duncan is understanding that sense in which she really was a revolutionary. She was a revolutionary artist and a revolutionary woman.
So what was the significance of what we just heard there?
Well, this was one of several pieces of concert music that Duncan controversially used as a soundtrack for her experimental expressive dances. And in this case, the Scriabin piece was the backdrop to a piece called The Revolutionary, where Duncan struck these extremely powerful poses in the guise of a figure who was being held in chains, who was trying to break free from their bonds. And it's a really striking, quite weighty piece of choreography where you see her sort of burdened, almost like pulled down into the ground. And what I think is so striking about the movement itself is that earthiness and that groundedness, which is a key characteristic of so much modern dance in this time, that it deliberately defied the ethereal nature of classical ballet, which is all about defying gravity and lightness and these sort of otherworldly themes. Modern dancers were about earthiness, humanity, and they allowed bodies to be depicted as heavy and grounded, but they also didn't shy away from difficult themes. And so we see this in works like The Revolutionary, where Duncan is desperately trying to break out of her bonds and never quite succeeds. And it was part of a trio of Scriabin pieces that she composed after returning from Russia, one of which also was apparently inspired by her memory of seeing someone being shot from the window of a train while she was travelling through the Russian countryside. So it's worth bearing in mind that this period where she is in Russia also coincides with the Civil War, and that she is seeing not just a society that is in flux, but she's seeing a society that's kind of descending into chaos in some cases. And all of this is reflected in these experimental and very expressive pieces of choreography.
Is that something that's sort of influenced then by sort of later Soviet realism and that kind of ideals then, that the kind of earthiness is that something that she's bringing back, or is that just a separate but related?
It's an interesting point. I think that Duncan's influence on Russian culture and Russian aesthetics beyond dance is something that hasn't really been dug into that deeply. It still feels like it's a missing piece of the puzzle when we look at Soviet culture, but her influence was really significant, that she set up a school with a really large enrolment of pupils. There is evidence to show that her ideas were still influencing artists that came long after she had left Russia. And yet there's just not a great deal of research that goes into her time in Russia, for a start, or her influence after she left. That a lot of the conversation focuses on the fallout in terms of losing her citizenship, her reputation in Europe and the US after her time there. But when we look at the importance of body culture and healthy body culture in the Soviet Union, and particularly the growth of new sports like rhythmic gymnastics, those principles are something we can trace right back to Duncan. I think the case of rhythmic gymnastics especially, there's a very clear link that goes right back to Duncan that just isn't explored in much detail.
That's interesting. I mean, did her reputation there suffer from sort of going back to the US? Did she sort of suffer on both sides of the Atlantic, I suppose?
It's a good question. I think in Russia she was still viewed very warmly as a supporter of Bolshevism and a supporter of revolutionary communism, even though her politics were not very well thought through. I think she had a sort of vague sympathy for the ideas of communism, but in practice, at that moment in time, the reality of and the difficulties of living in Russia was enough to send her packing her bags and heading for the hills. But I think she is someone who was received very warmly, was thought about with great fondness as someone who had left her comfortable life in Europe to establish something that was focused on education. And that was something that she wasn't herself a very committed teacher, because she didn't really like committing to schedules or doing anything at an appointed time. But she was obsessed with the idea of dance as education and of children having the opportunity to learn to dance and to express themselves through movement. So in that respect, her legacy is a really important one in Russia. And I think that there is probably still more of a warm feeling towards her than in her homeland, for instance.
So yeah, a lot of your book seems to deal with dancers and choreographers responding to huge world-changing events. I suppose we focused a lot around the sort of beginning period of that you're covering here. I was wondering if you could share an example from perhaps a bit later in the time period.
Well, there are two examples that I'd like to think about because they are two people who almost but not quite overlap with one another, but also span the middle to the end of the book. One of them is Catherine Dunham, who was an extraordinary woman. She was an African-American dancer, choreographer, and anthropologist. She started out doing fieldwork in the Caribbean, where she was interested in researching dance as an anthropological exercise. But very quickly she decided that she couldn't learn by observing, she had to learn by doing. And so she began to integrate into communities in Jamaica, in Martinique, and in Haiti, which was a country that had the greatest influence on her career and really shaped her entire life. And it was during this fieldwork that she shifted her attention away from simply studying dance and thinking about dance to enacting it and to bringing these dances back with her to the United States. And the country that she returned to was a segregated nation as well. So what was remarkable about Dunham was not just her ability to combine academic work with starting a dance company, but also her commitment to creating routes for a career in the arts for Black dancers, creating professional training opportunities for dancers who ballet teachers, for instance, wouldn't work with because they wouldn't have Black pupils in their classes. So Dunham threw herself into the creation, really, of a structure, an infrastructure for African-American dancers. And when it came to her work as a choreographer, she wasn't interested in simply presenting images of the exotic Caribbean for the sake of titillating the audience, but she really wanted to elevate Black culture and to show the diversity of Black culture, particularly for African American audiences. She wanted to create a picture of what global Black culture was and the importance of being part of a global society. And so she started out making these remarkable, they were sometimes described as ballets, but they were very, very modern pieces of dance that amalgamated the traditional dances she had learned while doing fieldwork in the Caribbean with contemporary techniques she was learning from modern dancers across the US. And she ended up devising a technique of her own, a language of dance known as Dunham technique, which is really distinctive because at its root is this emphasis on rhythm and undulation and movements of the pelvis and the shoulders that have their origins in African dance, West African dance specifically, that have been sort of filtered through migration through the Caribbean and that she brought back to the US, but at the same time also incorporating aspects of ballet and of European and American modern dance technique as well. But then later in her life, as she increasingly retired from the stage, her focus turned primarily to education. She was interested in creating schools and new opportunities for African American youths. And so she travelled the world extensively. She travelled all over South America. She travelled to Senegal, back to the Caribbean, and she ultimately settles in East St. Louis, where she sets up a school that is a dance school, but also a broader arts education institute for some of the most deprived African American youth in the country. And this is during the civil rights movement as well. So it's a time of great violence and upheaval. And she became a pillar of the community at this time, advocating for young people who had been arrested or who were being mistreated by the police. And she was a lifelong activist. She was someone who was always looking to elevate Black culture and to move away from exoticism into this really deep pride in a culture that was part of this broad African diaspora. And one of her dreams was to return to what she saw as the motherland, or the cradle of African culture, which was Senegal. She spent a short period of time in Dakar before she returned to Haiti. But in that time, there's a sort of missed opportunity, and this is a moment towards the end of the book that rather than a circumstance where two people come across each other, this was a moment where they missed one another maybe by a couple of weeks. That shortly after Dunham left, a Senegalese dancer who had been studying in Paris returned to her country and had heard that the great Catherine Dunham had been in Dakar. And so she was really disappointed to get back and realise that she wasn't there, that they never met. But this woman, Germaine Coney, announced, when I spoke to her, her description of this moment was that it reinforced how important Senegal was going to be on the world stage for dance, and that she was coming back to her home country, not wanting to create a career for herself in Europe, but really wanting to create a home for African modern dance. And that's what Akoni goes on to do. She sets up a school in the grounds of her house in suburban Dakar. She brings a technique that, like Dunham's, is an amalgamation of European languages of modern dance with the heritage, or as she calls them, patrimonial dances that she had learned from childhood onwards. She had been born in Benin and was brought up in Senegal. And she would go on to become one of the most influential African dancers of the 20th century, that she sets up a school on the beach overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, which now trains dancers from across the world. She collaborated extensively with Pina Bausch's company. Her dancers went on a global tour performing Pina Bausch's landmark Rite of Spring. And it felt like I remember when I went to see that performance thinking that was like the sort of, not the end point exactly, but it was a really interesting meeting of worlds, of all of these different figures in this expansive family tree coming together and seeing the generation that has come after incorporating all of these different influences from all around the globe, starting in East Asia and ending in a beach in Senegal with dancers from across the continent taking a piece of European modern dance on this global tour. And so it's not necessarily an account of 10 individuals so much as it is 10 individuals who are part of a big global family, and that the boundaries or the borders between them are much more porous than they might initially seem.
Yeah, I think that does really nicely encapsulate the way you're approaching that global history. It definitely does. It decenters Europe and America in a really interesting way. You've got things moving in all directions across that in a really interesting way. I suppose my last question was what kind of impact you're hoping the book will have. I mean, not just within your discipline and related disciplines, but also, I suppose, the broader cultural landscape.
I suppose firstly I would like people to read it. That would be nice. But what I really hope is that this book will appeal to people who profess to have no interest in dance whatsoever. That's really who I've written it for. I've encountered a lot of people through day-to-day interactions, through teaching, through my research, who, on asking what I do, will immediately reply with, "I know nothing about that." And I see that as an invitation to a conversation and a way of saying, you might know more about it than you think. You know, you might know some anecdotes that relate to some of these people, or you might know some of their collaborators, or you might be interested in the moments in time that this book focuses on. You might have an interest in, say, what culture looked like in Japan in the aftermath of the Second World War, or what dance, or maybe not necessarily dance, but what was happening in China in the 1990s as the country was moving towards a kind of post-socialist economy. You might have broader interests that are themes that are studied throughout the book as a whole. But more than that, I would really like people to pick it up, give it a chance, and give the material itself a chance. Look at some of the recordings of these choreographies that are available online. Engage with the physical aspect of it and try to put yourself in the minds but also in the bodies of the figures throughout the book, and think about what these dancers, these bodies, have to tell us about history, a history that is a global history but is also a shared history. So I suppose my ultimate hope is that it will nudge open the door for an interest in an art form people might think they have no interest in, but ultimately they realise it is applicable to their lives or to their wider interests, whether that's art, music, politics, history.
Great. Thank you very much. You can find more information about the research project in this episode in the show notes or on our website www.eca.ed.ac.uk/research. If you've enjoyed this episode of Artful Inquiry, please hit the subscribe button now to be notified of new episodes, and of course, do share the podcast with people you think would enjoy it. It just remains for me to thank our guest this week, Dr. Lucy Weir, and of course you, our listeners. Next time we'll be talking about reimagining early music through improvisation and electroacoustic composition.